first time we meet him, he's not a saint. He's standing in a circle of men who are breathing like animals, hot breath in cold air, fists white around stones. A young scholar with clean hands, watching a man get beaten to death by rocks. The victim's face is already swelling into something unrecognizable. Spit and blood glue dust to his lips. Someone vomits at the edge of the crowd, wipes their mouth, and throws anyway. And the young man? He doesn't flinch. He doesn't throw. He does something worse. He holds the killer's coats so their arms can swing freely. His name is Saul. If you came here for St. Paul, apostle of the nations, you found him. But here's the rot at the root of the halo. Before he preached mercy, he helped murder it. Quietly, efficiently, with the proud calm of someone certain God is on his side. And that's why you'll want to stay to the end. Because the question isn't whether Saul changes. The question is, what kind of force could ever bend a man like that? The city where Saul is born doesn't feel holy. It feels sharp. Tarsus, busy, loud, educated, and hard-edged. The kind of place where you learn to read a man's intentions by the way his sandals scrape the street. Trade routes run through it like veins, pumping languages, accents, and ideas into every market stall. Greek philosophy in one corner, Roman law in another. Local gods staring down from little shrines, wearing polished smiles that promise protection and demand payment. Saul grows up Jewish in a world that is not Jewish, and that tension shapes him early. The feeling of being watched, measured, challenged. It makes some people soft. It makes him steel. He learns the scriptures like a fighter learns weak spots. He learns arguments the way soldiers learn formations. He learns how to make words cut, how to make logic corner you so neatly you don't even realize you're trapped until you nod along. And the more he learns, the more he becomes convinced of one brutal idea. Truth is a boundary, and boundaries must be defended. Saul's family gives him more than faith. They give him something political. Something dangerous. Roman citizenship. That small legal fact is like a hidden knife in his belt. It doesn't make him Roman in his bones, but it lets him move through the empire with a kind of protected confidence. It means he can speak to officials without being instantly crushed. It means the world has to consider him. So he grows with two identities stitched together, Jewish devotion and Roman advantage, walking the line between cultures with the posture of someone who refuses to bow to either. But Saul doesn't dream of balance. He dreams of purity. As he becomes a young man, his hunger for certainty hardens into a kind of holy impatience. The world, in his eyes, is contaminated with compromise. He sees people mixing truth with convenience the way merchants mix clean grain with stones. He sees teachers watering down God's commands so the crowd will clap. And he hates it. Not the mild, eye-rolling hate of casual disagreement. No, Saul's hate is disciplined. It's structured. It wears clean clothing. It doesn't shout in the street. It writes lists. It memorizes names. Because Saul is the sort of man who believes a wrong idea can infect a city the way sickness does. One person whispers it, 10 people repeat it, 100 people reorganize their lives around it, and suddenly, what was unthinkable becomes normal. He does not want normal. He wants righteousness. So when Saul goes to Jerusalem, it is not tourism. It is not a spiritual retreat. It is training. Jerusalem is a furnace. Stone walls, hot dust, crowded steps, incense curling up from the temple, animals bleating, priests moving. With practiced seriousness, pilgrims push and jostle, coins clink. The air smells of sweat and sacrifice. And in that furnace, Saul finds his tribe, the Pharisees, the strict ones, the boundary keepers. He studies under the famous teachers, the kind whose words can settle debates like a gavel. He learns the law not only as devotion, but as a weapon against disorder. Saul's mind thrives here. He becomes the student who stays awake when everyone else is tired, the one who hears a contradiction and pounces, the one who can recite, interpret, defend, and attack. He is young, yes, but he is already dangerous, because Saul isn't only trying to be right, he's trying to be unstoppable. Then, Like a spark landing in dry straw, a rumor spreads through Jerusalem. An irritating, persistent story that refuses to die. A rabbi from Galilee, a troublemaker, executed. And yet his followers won't shut up. They claim he rose from the dead. They claim God has done something new. They gather in homes. They pray with strange confidence. They speak about forgiveness, like it's currency they can afford to waste. To Saul, it is not merely wrong. It is insulting. It's insulting to the law, insulting to the temple, insulting to every ancestor who bled, endured exile, obeyed through hardship. This new movement, the Way, people start calling it, feels like rebellion dressed as faith. And the more Saul listens, the more he realizes the real threat isn't that these people are violent, it's that they are contagious. They don't conquer by swords, they conquer by stories. They don't recruit by force, they recruit by hope. They don't argue like scholars, they testify like witnesses. And Saul can't stand that tone. The soft certainty of people who believe they've seen something Saul hasn't. There's a particular voice rising among them, cutting through the noise. Stephen. Not an apostle, not one of the original inner circle, but a man with fire in his chest and a blade in his tongue. Stephen speaks publicly, and people stop to listen. He challenges the old guard with terrifying clarity. He drags ancient history into the present like a body laid on the table. He speaks as if he's not afraid of the authorities who can ruin him. That kind of courage does something to Saul. It irritates him. It provokes him. It almost fascinates him, because Saul recognizes the pattern. This is how movements grow. This is how crowds turn. One voice becomes a magnet. Another voice becomes a banner. Stephen's words aren't just theology, they're momentum. So Saul does what he always does when he senses disorder. He moves toward it with purpose. He debates. He confronts. He argues with the sharpness he has trained for years. He expects Stephen to crumble under pressure. He expects to expose him, embarrass him, dismantle him. But Stephen doesn't crumble. And that is the first twist in Saul's story. Saul meets an opponent he cannot simply outthink. The debates become heated. The air around them feels like a storm about to break. Saul's side leans on tradition, law, the weight of the temple. Stephen leans on something else. Conviction that sounds almost like certainty from another world. When Stephen speaks, it's not only his arguments that disturb people, it's his eyes. The steadiness, the lack of fear, the strange calm of someone who believes death is a door, not a wall. Saul's frustration grows into a cold resolve. If he can't stop this movement with logic, he will stop it with authority. Accusations form like poison in a cup. Whispers, charges, outrage. Stephen is dragged before the council, and now Saul is close. Close enough to see the sweat on faces, close enough to feel the atmosphere shift from debate to danger. The hearing isn't fair. It's furious. The questions aren't sincere. They're traps. Stephen's words fan the flames instead of soothing them. He speaks as if he's already judged his judges. He tells them their history is filled with resistance to God's messengers. He tells them they're repeating that pattern now. He tells them they've betrayed the very thing they claim to defend. It lands like a slap. And the crowd does what crowds do when pride is wounded. It turns savage. They seize Stephen. They push him outside. They begin to stone him. Stoning is not clean. It is not quick. It is communal violence disguised as justice. It is a choreography of hatred, hands grabbing stones, arms hurling, bodies surging forward and back. You hear bones break. You hear gasps turn into choking sounds. You see the victim's body jerk with each impact, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. Stephen falls. He tries to speak. He prays. And Saul, young, disciplined Saul, stands there as the coats pile at his feet, as the killers strip down to throw harder. He becomes the guardian of the violence, the clerk of death, the one who makes it easier for righteousness to do its work. There's a sick kind of satisfaction in that role. Not pleasure exactly. Something more dangerous. The feeling of being aligned with God. The feeling that the world is being corrected. Stephen's voice fades. His body goes still. The circle loosens. People breathe again. Some look shaken, as if they can't believe what they've just done. Some look triumphant. Saul looks resolved. Because for Saul, this is not an ending. It is a beginning. The death of Stephen doesn't scare the movement into silence the way Saul expects. Instead, it scatters the followers outward like sparks thrown from a fire, into Judea, into Samaria, and farther. House meetings multiply, stories travel. The message spreads beyond Jerusalem's walls, slipping past the guards of tradition. And Saul hears something even more infuriating. It's growing. So Saul becomes what every movement fears. A man who thinks he is saving the world by destroying people. He starts hunting. Not randomly, not emotionally, systematically. He goes house to house, not with the chaos of a mob, but with the confidence of legal authority. Doors slam. Families cry. People are dragged into the street. Friend turns on friend out of fear. Saul's presence becomes a signal. Someone is about to lose everything. You can imagine the sound of his steps on stone alleys, the way conversations die when he enters a space, the way mothers pull children close, the way grown men suddenly remember errands elsewhere. Saul doesn't see himself as cruel. He sees himself as necessary. In his mind, he is protecting God's people from deception. He is defending the temple from corruption. He is holding the line between holiness and chaos. But something else is happening beneath that certainty. Something Saul cannot yet name. Because if you keep crushing a movement and it keeps rising, you begin to face a terrifying possibility. Either they are stubborn, beyond reason, or they have touched something real, and Saul cannot afford that thought. So he sharpens his mission. He hears that some followers have gone to Damascus, a city up the road, outside the immediate reach of Jerusalem's fear. Damascus, with its trade routes and mixed cultures, could become a new nerve center for this way, a place where the message spreads faster than anyone can contain it. To Saul, that is unacceptable. This is where the rivalry becomes personal. Saul doesn't just hate an idea, he hates the way this idea keeps escaping him, like trying to strangle smoke, like trying to imprison wind. He goes to the high priest and requests letters, official permission, authority in writing, so that if he finds any of these followers in Damascus, he can arrest them and bring them back in chains. It's a cold plan, efficient, clean on paper. But the road is never clean. Before Saul leaves, the city is awake with its usual noise. Vendors shouting, animals pulling carts, the temple's gravity pulling prayers upward. Saul moves through it like a man moving through destiny, convinced the next days will carve his name into the story of righteousness. And if you could have stopped him then, if you could have grabbed his sleeve and hissed, "Saul, you're becoming the very thing I claim to fight," he would have looked at you with that calm certainty and answered without hesitation, "I am doing God's work." He gathers companions. He tightens the straps. He sets his jaw. He starts walking toward Damascus with orders in his bag and judgment in his heart. And he has no idea that the man he thinks is dead is about to meet him on the road. The road to Damascus is not dramatic at first. It's just dust and sun, white heat on stone, dry wind scraping the throat, sandals grinding small pebbles into smaller pebbles. Saul walks with his jaw clenched, the official letters tucked safely away like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Around him, companions talk in short bursts, then fall silent again. The silence has weight. The quiet confidence of men who believe they are about to do something righteous. Saul's mind rehearses the coming scene the way a prosecutor rehearses a case. Names, faces, hiding places. The way fear will look in someone's eyes when authority finally catches up to them. He imagines chains biting wrists. He imagines the relief of Jerusalem's leaders when he returns with proof that the infection has been contained. And then, without warning, the world tears open. Not metaphorically, not gently. One moment there is sun. The next there is something brighter than the sun. An eruption of light that doesn't just illuminate the road, it overwhelms it, erases. It makes the air itself feel like it's burning. Saul's body reacts before his mind can. He falls hard, face first into the dirt, hands scrambling as if the ground is suddenly the only solid thing left in creation. And in the middle of that impossible brightness comes a voice, not distant, not vague, not the voice of conscience. A voice that speaks Saul's name like it owns it. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It hits him like a punch delivered from inside his chest. Saul's mouth opens, but what comes out is not an argument. It's a question, small and raw and terrified in its simplicity. Who are you, Lord? And the answer is the twist that shatters his entire life. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. For a heartbeat, everything inside Saul tries to reject it. Impossible. Jesus is dead, executed, buried, a false Messiah, a threat eliminated. But the voice doesn't debate. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't prove itself with logic. It commands, get up, go into the city. You will be told what you must do. The brightness collapses as suddenly as it came, leaving Saul blinking in ordinary daylight. He pushes up, coughing dust, disoriented, humiliated, trying to regain control of his limbs, his thoughts, his dignity. Then he realizes the horror. He can't see. His eyes are open. They feel open. He can feel the wind, the heat, the grit on his eyelashes. But the world is gone. Just darkness. A blank, swallowing curtain where certainty used to be. The man who came to Damascus to drag others into chains is now led by the hand like a child. His companions, men who had expected to witness Saul's triumph, suddenly become his guides, their fingers gripping his arms as they steer him forward. Damascus rises around them with its smells and sounds. Water somewhere, animals, voices calling in a language Saul recognizes but cannot place. He hears life continuing. He hears normality, and he realizes, with a humiliating clarity, that something has shifted in the universe, and he is the only one who can't see where he's going. They bring him to a house. They sit him down, and Saul, who once thrived on control, enters 3 days of pure powerlessness. No food, no drink, no light, only the dark, and the memory of that voice. Somewhere in Damascus, a disciple of Jesus named Ananias is praying. He's not a warrior, not famous, just a believer trying to survive in a city that suddenly feels unsafe because rumors travel faster than feet. Saul is coming. The hunter is here. The man whose name makes people hide their children. Ananias knows Saul's reputation the way a village knows a wolf's silhouette. He has heard the stories. Home raids, arrests, families torn apart, believers hauled off like animals. So when Ananias senses a divine command, go to Saul, it doesn't feel like a gentle spiritual nudge. It feels like being ordered to walk into a lion's mouth. Ananias protests. Of course he does. Lord, I've heard about this man. How much harm he has done. And the reply that comes is not comfort, but a sentence that rewrites history. Go, he is a chosen instrument of mine, to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. Chosen instrument, not useful pawn, not temporary warning. An instrument, something shaped, sharpened, used to make music or to carve stone. Ananias goes anyway, because obedience sometimes looks like stepping forward while your stomach twists with fear. He enters the house where Saul sits in darkness. Try to imagine that moment. The persecutor, blind and trembling. The disciple, sweating with caution. The air thick with everything unsaid between them. Ananias approaches. Saul can hear him, can sense a presence. Saul might even recognize the careful rhythm of someone afraid. Then Ananias speaks words that, under the circumstances, are almost outrageous. Brother Saul, brother, not monster, not enemy, brother. And in that single word, something inside Saul cracks again. Because it is easier to fight people who hate you. It is harder to fight people who offer you belonging. Ananias tells him why he has come. He places hands on Saul. Hands that could have pulled away, hands that could have clenched into fists, hands that instead choose contact. And then the darkness breaks. Saul's sight returns not like a curtain rising, but like something peeling away, like scales shedding from eyes that have been blind in more ways than one. Light pours back in, shapes, faces, the room. Ananias. The ordinary world now feels newly violent in its clarity. Saul is baptized. The man who came with arrest warrants submits to water like a surrender. And for the first time in his adult life, Saul's strength is not built on certainty. It is built on being undone. But conversion doesn't erase consequences. It doesn't erase memory. It doesn't erase fear. As Saul starts to eat and drink again, strength returns to his body, and a different kind of danger begins to rise. Because Saul does what intense people do when they find a new truth. He goes all in, immediately, loudly, and with the same sharp mind that once hunted this very faith. Soon, the synagogues of Damascus hear a new voice, one that feels impossible. Saul stands up, and the room shifts. People recognize him. Whispers move like insects through the crowd. That's him. That's the one from Jerusalem. That's the enforcer. And then Saul begins to speak, and the words are dynamite. He argues that Jesus is the Son of God. He insists the crucified man is the Messiah. He reasons from Scripture with the same precision that once defended strict boundaries, only now the boundaries have moved. It's as if a sword has switched hands. The shock is physical. Faces tighten. Men lean forward, suspicious. Others recoil, offended. Some look at Saul like they're watching a betrayal in real time. And Saul looks like a man on fire. Not the polished fire of ambition. A wilder flame. Something that burns him as it burns through his audience. He speaks as if he can't help it, as if silence would be violence, which is when the rivalries flip. Before, Saul had enemies in the followers of Jesus. Now, Saul becomes an enemy to the world that once applauded him. The same kind of hatred he once fed begins to circle back toward him, because institutions do not forgive defectors. A man who changes sides is not merely wrong, he is dangerous. He carries inside knowledge. He exposes how the machine works. He proves that certainty can break. People begin to plan. Quietly at first. Meetings, murmurs, glances at doors. Damascus becomes a chessboard. Saul feels eyes on him. He knows the texture of threat. He used to be the threat. Now it presses against him from the outside like heat through a wall. And the most humiliating twist of all is this. The followers of Jesus, the people Saul tried to destroy, are now the ones protecting him. They learn of the plot. They warn him. They gather under cover of night, and they do something that feels almost absurd in its simplicity. They lower Saul in a basket through an opening in the city wall. Picture it. The former hunter, curled awkwardly in a woven basket like cargo, lowered into darkness by the hands of those he once terrorized. His heart pounding, waiting for a shout, a spear, a sudden yank of rope that would send him crashing down. The night air bites. The stone wall scrapes. The city that was supposed to witness his victory becomes the place he escapes like a fugitive. And as his feet hit ground outside Damascus, one truth becomes unavoidable. Saul has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Now he has to go to Jerusalem, not as Saul the Pharisee, the enforcer, the rising star, but as Saul the traitor. Saul the problem. Saul, the man claiming Jesus is alive. He returns to the city that shaped him, and the tension is immediate. Jerusalem doesn't welcome people who change. Jerusalem remembers. Jerusalem keeps score. And the followers of Jesus, understandably, do not trust him. Why would they? Saul's name is a scar. Some of them have lost family because of him. Some have been dragged from homes because of his orders. Some have nightmares with his footsteps in them. So when Saul tries to join them, it's like walking into a room full of people you have harmed and saying, "I'm different now." They hesitate. They avoid him. They whisper that it might be a trap, that Saul is pretending, infiltrating, waiting for the right moment to strike. Saul is alone in a new way now. rejected by his old allies, untrusted by his new family. And this is where another man enters the story, like a hinge swinging the door of history open. Barnabas. Not a cynic, not an enforcer, a bridge builder, the kind of person who sees potential where others see threat. Barnabas listens to Saul, watches him, weighs his story, and decides to stand beside him. Barnabas brings Saul to the apostles. He vouches for him. He tells them about the road, the voice, the blindness, the baptism, the bold preaching, the escape. Barnabas essentially says, "This is real. Let him in." And with that, Saul begins to move among the believers in Jerusalem. He speaks boldly again, his mind and voice relentless, as if trying to outrun the memory of who he used to be. He debates. He argues. He pushes the message into places where it will spark reaction. But Saul's intensity is a double-edged blade. He cannot do anything halfway. So when he meets opposition, especially from groups skilled in debate, he engages with the full force of his sharpened intellect. The arguments escalate. Voices rise. The air turns metallic with hostility. Saul's past makes him a special target. A man who flips sides publicly invites punishment from both camps. There are people in Jerusalem who feel personally humiliated by him now. They used to point to Saul as proof that the strict path produces strong defenders. Now that proof has become an accusation. And once again, a plot begins. Not theoretical, not, "we dislike him." A plan to kill him. This is the recurring rhythm of Saul's rebirth. Speak, ignite, provoke, get hunted, escape. And each time he escapes, the tension tightens, because it's starting to look like Saul isn't just surviving danger. He's being driven by it, forged by it. The believers, realizing the risk, move him out. They send him away for safety, pushing him out of Jerusalem like a seed carried by wind, because some stories cannot stay contained in one city. And Saul returns to the place where his life began, back toward Tarsus, carrying something he didn't have before. Not merely a new belief, a calling. Because embedded in that voice on the Damascus road was a destiny Saul hasn't fully understood yet. To carry the name of Jesus beyond Israel, to the nations, to the Gentiles, to the places where Hebrew scripture is unknown, where pagan temples dominate skylines, where languages twist differently on the tongue, and where the idea of a crucified Messiah sounds not only strange, but offensive. This is where the whole world starts to widen. And as Saul, soon to be known as Paul, sits with that widening horizon, a question hovers like thunder. If God can take the man who held the coats at a stoning and turn him into a messenger of mercy, what will he do with the rest of the empire? And what enemies will rise, inside the faith, outside it, and inside Paul himself, to stop that message from spreading? Because the next stage isn't just about belief. It's about collision. It's about cities. It's about riots. It's about rival preachers, jealous craftsmen, suspicious rulers, and a relentless internal opponent. Paul's own past, following him, like a shadow that refuses to die. The first time Paul realizes the message has escaped the borders of his old world, it happens in a place that smells like salt and sweat and money. Antioch. A city that doesn't ask permission to be complicated. Merchants haggle in half a dozen languages. Foreign soldiers lean on spears, bored and watchful. Statues of gods stare down from marble with blank confidence, promising blessings for a fee. At night, the streets glow with oil lamps, and the shadows move like secrets. And somewhere inside that electric chaos, a community forms, Jews and Gentiles together, praying to the God of Israel and calling Jesus Lord, with the kind of certainty that used to make Paul furious. Here, they give the movement a name that will stick like a brand burned into history. Christians. And it's here that Barnabas goes looking for Paul, because the mission is growing too fast for gentle hands alone. Barnabas is a builder, but Paul is a battering ram with a theologian's brain. Barnabas knows it, and he brings Paul into the center of the storm. Paul arrives with his old intensity, but it's been re-aimed. He no longer protects boundaries. He breaks them. He no longer hunts believers, he manufactures them. And then the call becomes specific. The community fasts, they pray, they sense direction. Hands are laid on Barnabas and Paul, not for comfort, but for deployment. Like soldiers being sent out, except the battlefield is cities and synagogues and marketplaces. Paul steps onto the road again, but this time he isn't carrying arrest warrants. He's carrying a message that will get him beaten for saying it. And here's the key conflict that starts to sharpen into a real rivalry, one that follows him like a stalking animal. Paul versus the gatekeepers. Not just outsiders who hate the message, but insiders who want to control it. Men who believe the Jesus movement must stay tethered to old boundaries, old marks of belonging, old requirements. Men who look at Gentile converts and say, "Not so fast. If they want in, they must become like us first." Paul knows what that kind of certainty does. He used to be it. So when the mission begins, when he sails to Cyprus, then pushes into Asia Minor, his preaching carries a dangerous edge. The offer of belonging without the old entry fee, grace without the knife, covenant without the ethnic border. It sounds like freedom. To some, it sounds like blasphemy. In city after city, Paul's pattern becomes a drumbeat. He arrives. He goes first to the synagogue, because he's still Jewish, still anchored in Scripture, still convinced that the story of Israel points to Jesus like an arrow. He reasons. He argues. He tells the story. Promises, prophets, Messiah, crucifixion, resurrection. Some people listen like thirsty ground taking rain. Others stiffen like a door being locked from the inside. And then the message spills out of the synagogue into the streets, where Gentiles lean in, curious, hungry for meaning that doesn't require them to become someone else first. That's when trouble ignites. Because religion isn't just belief in these cities. It's economy, it's identity, it's reputation, it's power. Paul is not just preaching. He is rearranging social order. In one city, Pisidian Antioch, the response is so intense that crowds gather. Gentiles want more. The word spreads, swelling like a wave. And then jealousy shows its face, not always as honest anger. Sometimes it dresses as piety. Sometimes it wears the mask of protecting tradition. But underneath it is a simpler truth. People hate losing control of what they think they own. They stir opposition. They poison minds. They turn respected leaders against Paul. Soon, Paul and Barnabas are pushed out. Paul shakes the dust off his feet, an ancient gesture of judgment, and moves on. In Iconium, the division deepens. Some believe, some plot. The city splits along invisible lines, and the atmosphere becomes so dangerous that Paul has to flee again. In Lystra, the story turns almost surreal. Paul heals a man who has never walked, his ankles strengthened, his legs steady, his body suddenly doing what it has never done before. The crowd sees it and jumps to the conclusion their culture has been trained to make for centuries. The gods have come down in human form. They call Barnabas Zeus. They call Paul Hermes, because Paul is the main speaker. And now imagine the horror for Paul. Priests bring bulls and garlands, ready to sacrifice to them. The air fills with celebratory shouting. Exactly the kind of attention that could have fed Saul's old pride like gasoline. But Paul rips his clothes, an ancient sign of grief and protest, and shouts that they are only human. He tells them to turn from these empty idols to the living God. For a moment, it works. The sacrifice is stopped, and then another twist. Cruel and fast. The same crowd that tried to worship him is suddenly persuaded to kill him. Opponents arrive from nearby cities, and it doesn't take much. Human admiration is thin. It tears easily. One minute you're a god, the next minute you're trash. They stone Paul. Not symbolic stoning, not metaphor. Actual stones. The same kind of death Stephen suffered. The same kind of death Paul once stood beside. Rocks strike his skull, his ribs, his spine, his face. He collapses. Blood spreads dark into dust, and the crowd drags his body out of the city like waste, assuming he's dead. It's a mirror held up to Paul's past so perfectly it's almost unbearable. But then he moves. The believers gather around him, shocked, shaking, and Paul gets up. Not triumphantly, not like an action hero. Like a man who has decided in the ruins of his own body that he will not stop. He goes back into the city. That's not just courage. That's defiance with a pulse. And as this battered apostle travels, planting small communities like sparks, the rivalry with the gatekeepers grows sharper, because the more Gentiles believe, the more the old questions howl. Do they have to be circumcised? Do they have to take on the full law of Moses? Do they have to become culturally Jewish to belong to the Jewish Messiah? Some teachers show up behind Paul like thieves following a caravan, undoing his work, telling new believers they're incomplete. Second, class, not truly inside unless they submit to the old markers. And Paul explodes. Not with quiet annoyance. With the kind of fury that only comes from someone who knows how slavery feels because he used to hand out the chains. He writes letters, urgent, sharp, sometimes scorching, because he can't be everywhere at once. He argues that faith in Jesus is the entry, that grace is the foundation, that forcing Gentiles into Jewish identity is not holiness. It's betrayal of the very point of the gospel. This conflict doesn't stay local. It becomes big enough to threaten the unity of the entire movement. So leaders gather in Jerusalem to settle it, a meeting that will echo for centuries. Paul comes not as a timid convert, but as a representative of a revolution. Gentiles are receiving the Spirit. Lives are changing. Communities are forming. God is moving outside the old boundaries. The debate is intense. You can almost see the sweat, hear the raised voices. On one side, tradition, caution, identity protection. On the other side, evidence of transformation, the unpredictable freedom of God. This isn't just theology. It's belonging. It's who gets to be called family. And after argument, testimony, and hard listening, the decision lands. Gentiles are not required to become Jews to follow Jesus. They're asked to avoid certain practices tied to idolatry and exploitation, but the core message is clear. They are in. Paul's mission is not a rogue wave. It's recognized. But recognition doesn't erase danger. If anything, it increases it. Because now Paul is no longer just a traveling preacher. He's a catalyst, a man whose presence triggers chain reactions. He pushes west. Philippi, a Roman colony with pride in its status, the kind of place where power walks tall. Here, Paul meets a woman named Lydia, a seller of purple cloth, expensive, elite fabric. She listens, and her heart opens. A home becomes a foothold. A church begins in living rooms. But then a different kind of confrontation appears. A slave girl exploited for profit, used by men who make money off her spiritual torment. Paul casts out the spirit afflicting her. The girl is freed, and the men who own her lose income. That's the moment you learn something dark about human systems. People will forgive many things, but they don't forgive you for disrupting their profit. Paul and his companion Silas are dragged into public, accused, stripped, beaten. Not a symbolic beating, the kind that makes skin tear and breath hitch. They're thrown into prison, feet locked in stocks, bodies bruised, backs bleeding into dirt. And in the middle of that filth, at midnight, they do something almost insane. They sing, not because it feels good, because they refuse to let suffering rewrite the truth they believe. The other prisoners listen. The jail smells like sweat and fear. Then the ground shakes. An earthquake, violent, sudden, rattles the foundations. Doors swing open, chains loosen. The jailer wakes, sees the doors open, assumes the prisoners have fled, and reaches for his sword to kill himself, because failure will be punished anyway. But Paul shouts into the chaos, "Don't harm yourself! We're all here!" The jailer trembles. He brings light. He falls before Paul, not as an official, but as a desperate man whose worldview has cracked. What must I do to be saved? And in that moment the story flips again. The prison becomes a birthplace. The jailer and his household believe. They wash Paul's wounds with their own hands, hands that hours earlier represented the system that beat him. By morning, officials try to quietly release Paul. But Paul reveals another hidden blade: Roman citizenship. Suddenly, the power dynamic flips. They beat a Roman citizen without trial. They're in trouble. They come in person, suddenly polite, suddenly careful, and ask him to leave. Paul leaves, but not before strengthening the new community. Because Paul doesn't just survive cities. He leaves behind living seeds. In Thessalonica, opposition erupts into riots. In Berea, people examine the scriptures eagerly. In Athens, Paul stands in a city dripping with intellectual pride and idols. Altars everywhere, gods everywhere, a marketplace of philosophies. He speaks to thinkers who treat ideas like sport. He points to an altar, to an unknown God, and tells them the God they don't know has made himself known. Some mock him when he speaks of resurrection. Others want to hear more. In Corinth, a port city with a reputation for excess, Paul stays longer. He works with his hands, tent-making, because he refuses to let anyone say he's preaching for profit. He builds a community in a city where temptation is sold openly, like food. But even in these successes, the rival conflict keeps mutating. It's no longer only Paul versus external opposition. It becomes Paul versus rival super-apostles, rival teachers who question his authority, mock his weakness, exploit communities, demand loyalty. They present themselves as impressive, polished, charismatic, powerful, while Paul looks like a battered traveler with scars and a voice that sometimes shakes with emotion. They say Paul is not impressive enough, not forceful enough, not holy enough, not legitimate enough. Paul fights back with a strange weapon: his weakness. He lists his sufferings, not as pity, but as proof. Beatings, shipwrecks, hunger, danger from robbers, danger from his own people, danger from Gentiles, sleepless nights, anxiety for the churches. He refuses to boast in power the way the world boasts. He boasts in endurance, because Paul's message is not, "Follow me, I'm strong." It's follow Jesus, because he meets you in the place where you are not. And that, ironically, is why the message spreads. Because the empire is full of weak people, the poor, the enslaved, the sick, the women whose voices are ignored, the outsiders who never quite belong, the men exhausted by the constant pressure to perform strength. Paul offers a community where dignity is not purchased, where belonging is not negotiated through status. That is revolutionary. And revolutions trigger backlash. By the time Paul sets his sights on Jerusalem again, he knows it won't be safe. He feels it in the tightening pattern of his life. Each city more volatile, each opponent more organized, each misunderstanding more expensive. He travels anyway, because Paul has become the kind of man who doesn't measure a path by safety. He measures it by calling, and he is walking, step by step, toward a collision with the most powerful machine in his world: the Roman state, the temple authorities, the fragile, growing movement of Jesus' followers trapped between them. Paul is approaching the moment when his message will no longer cause just riots in streets. It will reach courts, chains, trials, and the kind of ending that turns a life into legend. He walks toward Jerusalem knowing exactly what the city can do to a man. Not maybe. Not possibly. He knows Jerusalem's moods the way sailors know storms. He's felt its religious gravity, its pride, its sharp teeth. And still he goes, carrying offerings, greetings, plans, and an awareness that every step forward is a step closer to chains. Friends beg him not to. Prophets warn him. In crowded rooms, people cry and hold his arms like they can physically keep him from fate. But Paul has reached a point where fear is no longer the steering wheel. He isn't reckless. He's resolved. Because Paul's life has become a strange kind of wager. If the message is true, then even prisons are platforms. And Jerusalem, as always, is waiting. The moment he arrives, the air tightens. This isn't the Paul who slipped out of city walls in a basket. This is a man known across provinces, Admired by some, resented by others, misunderstood by nearly everyone. Rumors cling to him like dust. To some Jews, he's a traitor. To some Gentiles, he's a miracle. To the gatekeepers, he's a walking problem, proof that God is moving beyond the fences they built. He tries to move carefully. He meets leaders. He listens. He attempts to show respect for tradition without surrendering truth. But in a city like Jerusalem, careful moves don't always matter once the crowd catches the scent of blood. It happens fast, like a match dropped in oil. A shout. A surge. Accusations that hit like stones. He's defiling the temple. He's teaching against the law. He's bringing outsiders into holy space. The truth of the charges barely matters. A mob doesn't need truth. A mob needs a target. Paul is grabbed. Hands clutch his robe. Fingernails dig into skin. The noise swells into that familiar roar. Human voices merging into one angry animal. The beating starts in the chaotic way violence usually begins. Not as a single clean strike, but as a rain of fists, boots, elbows. The world turns sideways. Dust and spit and sweat mix. The temple, supposed to be a house of prayer, becomes a backdrop for a man being torn apart. And then, in a twist only history can deliver, Rome interrupts. Soldiers push through the crowd, armor flashing, discipline cutting a line through chaos. The mob hates the interruption, but they hate losing their prey even more. So the shouting intensifies as Paul is dragged toward the barracks. Now Paul is at the edge of two machines. Religious fury behind him, Roman order in front of him. And Paul does what he's always done when cornered. He speaks. Not to beg, to steer the story. He asks permission to address the crowd. Imagine the shock. A bruised man, dragged like a criminal, turning his face, swollen, bloody, toward the very people who want him dead. And using his voice like a blade, he tells them who he was. He tells them the Damascus Road wasn't a convenient new idea, but a collision. He tells them he didn't choose this. It chose him. Then he says the line that detonates everything. God sent him to the Gentiles, to the nations, to the outsiders. The crowd erupts again. Rage multiplied, the kind of rage that demands not just punishment, but erasure. They scream for death. They throw dust into the air like a curse. Rome decides he's too volatile to leave in public. Paul is taken inside. Interrogation looms. Painful, humiliating, designed to extract information from bodies rather than minds. And then Paul reveals that hidden knife again. Roman citizenship. It's the moment the interrogator's confidence changes to calculation. Roman law is a strange shield. It doesn't love you, but it can restrain the hand that wants to hurt you. Suddenly, Paul isn't just a religious troublemaker. He's a legal risk. That doesn't make him safe. It just changes the kind of danger he's in. Now the conflict becomes a chess game. Hearings, councils, plots. Religious leaders can't openly kill him without Rome's attention, so they try strategy. They try to trap him with words, to turn his story into sedition. Paul answers with that relentless mix of intellect and fire, sometimes sounding like a lawyer, sometimes like a prophet, always like a man who has already accepted suffering as a cost of entry. There's a conspiracy to assassinate him on the road. Rome hears of it. And under cover of night, Paul is moved with an absurd display of force. Soldiers, horses, torches, like an entire military escort for one stubborn preacher. It's almost darkly funny. The empire doesn't know what to do with him. It can't ignore him. It can't safely release him. It can't easily silence him without admitting fear. So it does what systems do when confused. It delays. Paul sits in custody. Years pass in bureaucratic slow motion. Governors change. Hearings happen. Nothing resolves. And the whole time, Paul remains Paul. Turning conversations into sermons, prison guards into listeners, delays into opportunities. Then comes the move that sounds like madness and strategy at the same time. He appeals to Caesar. It's not bravado. It's not a stunt. It's Paul seeing a door inside the empire's legal structure and forcing it open with his shoulder. If the gospel is for the nations, then the heart of the empire is not off limits. Rome, the city that makes kings nervous, becomes the destination. And that's how the next twist begins. Not in a cathedral or a courtroom, but on a ship. A ship is a fragile thing to bet your life on. Wood, rope, sailcloth, human confidence. The sea does not respect any of it. Paul boards as a prisoner, chained to Rome's process. The salt air tastes like risk. The crew watches the sky. The season is wrong for sailing. Paul warns them. There's danger ahead. But sailors are proud people, and pride loves to argue with caution. They sail anyway. The storm that comes isn't poetic. It's monstrous. Wind screaming like something alive. Waves slamming the hull with blunt force. The ship creaks and groans as if it's begging to be spared. Cargo is thrown overboard. Money tossed into darkness in exchange for survival. The sky becomes a lid of black. Days pass without sun or stars. No navigation, no orientation. Just terror and exhaustion, and the smell of fear trapped in wet wood. Men, stop eating. Some whisper prayers to gods they barely believe in. Others stare with hollow eyes, already halfway dead in their minds. And in the middle of that, Paul stands. Prisoner Paul, bruised Paul, unwanted Paul, and speaks like someone who has found calm in a place that should not have calm. He tells them an angel has appeared. He tells them they will survive, but the ship will be lost. He tells them not to give in to despair. He urges them to eat, to keep strength, to keep living. And here's the quiet shock. In that moment, the chained prisoner becomes the leader. Authority shifts in storms. Titles dissolve. Courage becomes rank. The ship breaks on rocks. Wood splinters. Men hit cold water and fight to breathe. Some swim. Some cling to planks like desperate children. The sea tries to take them, but it doesn't. They wash up on shore alive, soaked, shaking, coughing sea out of their lungs. An island. A fire. Strangers offering warmth. Paul, shivering, gathers sticks like everyone else. No special treatment, no drama, just survival. And then, as if the story refuses to let him have an ordinary moment, danger strikes again. A venomous snake bites his hand. The locals react instantly, wide-eyed, certain this is justice. In their worldview, a man who survives the sea only to be bitten must be cursed. They wait for him to swell, to collapse, to die. They watch him like you watch a sentence being carried out. Paul doesn't panic. He shakes the snake into the fire, and nothing happens. No swelling, no collapse, no death. The crowd's reaction flips in seconds, because human thinking is often just a pendulum swinging between extremes. They go from he's condemned to he's divine. Paul refuses both stories. He isn't cursed. He isn't a god. He is, as always, a witness. On that island, he heals the sick, not as a magician, but as a sign that the message he carries is not theoretical. It touches bodies. It touches fear. It touches the places where people feel abandoned by heaven. Then, finally, Rome. Not a myth. A real city. Roads like arteries. Soldiers like insects. Marble, smoke, ambition. Paul arrives still under guard, still under the empire's leash, but he is allowed a kind of house arrest. A chain, yes, but also a door. Visitors come. Conversations happen. And Paul does what Paul does. He turns the room into a crossroads. This is where his legacy quietly becomes immortal. Because from confinement he writes letters scratched into history, messages to communities he birthed in chaos. Words that carry warmth, correction, rage, tenderness. Words that sound like they were written with both a pen and a pulse. He writes to people divided by ethnicity and class and ego, insisting they are one body. He writes to people drowning in shame, insisting grace is not a rumor but a reality. He writes to people obsessed with power, insisting true power looks like self-giving love. He writes to people afraid of suffering, insisting suffering is not proof of defeat. He writes to people confused about spiritual forces, painting the world as a battlefield of invisible pressures and calling them to endurance. And yes, some of those lines will be quoted later in places Paul could not have imagined, in languages that didn't exist in his world, on continents he never saw. But in Rome, the story still has teeth, because the empire's patience is not infinite. A fire will burn through the city in Nero's era, and whether or not Paul has anything to do with it doesn't matter. Scapegoats are, chosen for usefulness, not accuracy. Christians become convenient targets, strange, stubborn, refusing to worship the emperor like a god. Rumors spread. Fear becomes policy. Torture becomes entertainment. Faith becomes a crime. And Paul is too visible to disappear quietly. The final stretch of his life tightens like a rope pulled taut. He is imprisoned again, this time not in a rented house but in harsher conditions. Darker, colder, less polite. The machine is no longer curious about him. It's done. Tradition says his end comes by beheading, an execution method often used for citizens, swift compared to the slow cruelty others faced. It's almost ironic. The same citizenship that sometimes shielded him now shapes the way he is killed. Try to picture the last morning. Not heroic music, not cinematic speeches. Stone, iron, the smell of damp. Guards who have done this before and want it done quickly. Paul older now, body marked by roads and prisons and beatings, the face of a man who has paid for his convictions in installments over decades. And what's shocking is not that he dies, it's that he dies like someone who has already won. Because the empire can cut off a head. It cannot unwrite a message that has already lodged itself in thousands of hearts. It cannot chase down every copy of every letter. It cannot unsay words that have already been spoken into hungry communities. It cannot unlight a fire that's already leaping from home to home, city to city, generation to generation. Paul's rivals think killing him will end the problem. But Paul's whole life has been a lesson in unintended consequences. Every attempt to silence the message becomes a megaphone. And after his death, the story keeps expanding, almost insultingly so, from the empire's point of view. The movement spreads across roads Rome built for its own glory. It slips into households, markets, barracks, palaces. His letters are copied, read aloud, memorized, argued over, cherished. Communities keep forming, often small and fragile, but stubbornly alive. Now, zoom out. Far beyond Rome, beyond the Mediterranean, beyond the map Paul knew. Centuries later, Christianity takes deep root in Africa in many forms, through complex histories, trade, migration, missionary work, local revivals, indigenous movements. And in Nigeria, a country of immense ethnic diversity, intense spirituality, and vibrant Christian life, Paul becomes not just a historical figure, but a living voice. Why Paul, specifically, is so deeply honored there? Because Paul feels like he was written for a place like Nigeria. Nigeria is many peoples, many languages, many identities. In that kind of landscape, the question, who belongs, is not abstract. It's daily life. And Paul, more than almost anyone, speaks into belonging. He insists that faith can weld people together without erasing their cultures. That unity doesn't require uniformity. That a community can be one body with many parts, each carrying dignity. Paul also speaks to conversion as a real, dramatic rupture. Nigeria's Christianity often takes the supernatural seriously. Deliverance, spiritual warfare, visible transformation, the sense that the unseen world presses on the seen world. Paul's story begins with an overwhelming encounter and continues with a life that treats the spiritual realm as real and active. When he talks about armor, endurance, powers, and principalities, he's not writing metaphors that float above reality. He's naming a conflict many Nigerians already feel in their bones. And then there's Paul's resilience. Nigeria has regions where Christians have faced pressure, insecurity, grief, and hardship, where faith is not a decorative identity, but a tested one. Paul's life reads like a manual for perseverance, beaten but continuing, opposed but not extinguished, wounded but still building. When he says suffering can be endured without surrendering hope, he isn't speaking from comfort. He speaks with scars. His letters also sit at the center of preaching, teaching, and daily devotion. Nigerian churches, Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, Pentecostal, Evangelical, draw constantly from Paul's words. You can walk into a service and hear Romans used to explain salvation, Corinthians used to teach spiritual gifts and love, Ephesians used to speak about spiritual battle and family life, Galatians used to talk about freedom from bondage, Philippians used to teach joy under pressure. Paul is honored because he's practical. He doesn't just soar in theology, he talks about money, marriage, community conflict, leadership, forgiveness, anger, humility, generosity, discipline. He sounds like someone who understands messy humans trying to be holy in a messy world. And Nigeria loves saints and leaders who feel useful, not distant statues, but voices that still guide a living community. Even in stone and architecture you can feel it. Churches named for Saint Paul, cathedrals carrying his name, schools and seminaries echoing his legacy. But more important than buildings is the way his story functions like a mirror. If God could turn a violent gatekeeper into an apostle of the nations, then no one is beyond transformation. Not a persecutor, not a cynic, not a person trapped in habits they hate, not a country battling its own fractures. Paul's life is honored because it refuses to let anyone stay hopeless. And that might be the final twist. Paul set out to erase a movement. Instead, he became one of its loudest architects. He tried to protect God by crushing people. Instead, he discovered a God who rebuilds people, even the ones who did the crushing. He wanted control. He was given a calling. He carried chains for others. He wore chains himself. And the message he carried walked right through those chains, out of prisons, over oceans, into nations he never imagined. Until, in Nigeria, it's spoken with drums, choirs, megaphones, and midnight prayers, alive, urgent, and still dangerous to anything that depends on keeping people out.